The cold autumn wind whistled through the broken windows of the small cabin, where Clara O'Brien sat hunched over her father's old ledger book. Her fingers traced the faded ink marks that told the story of their failure in this harsh frontier town. Every number seemed to mock her, every debt larger than the last. Her father, Patrick, had been so sure they would find prosperity in Deadwood Gulch, but 3 months after his death from fever, Clara found herself drowning in obligations she could never hope to repay. The cabin felt emptier than usual that evening. Clara had already sold most of their belongings piece by piece over the past weeks. The good china her mother had treasured, gone. Her father's pocket watch, gone. Even the warm winter coat that had belonged to her grandmother now hung in someone else's closet. Yet still, the debts mounted higher each day. A heavy knock at the door made Clara's heart jump. She knew that knock well by now. Charlie Morton, the owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, had been coming by every few days to remind her of what she owed. Her father had borrowed money from Charlie to buy mining equipment, always promising that the next dig would be the one to pay everything back. But Patrick O'Brien had died before finding even a speck of gold dust. "Evening, Miss O'Brien," Charlie said as she opened the door. He was a large man with cold gray eyes and hands that looked like they had seen plenty of hard work in their time. Behind him stood 2 other men Clara recognized from the saloon. "We need to have ourselves a talk." Clara stepped aside reluctantly, knowing she had no choice but to let them in. The 3 men filled her small cabin, making it feel even more cramped and uncomfortable. Charlie sat down heavily at her father's old wooden table while the other 2 remained standing near the door. "I've been patient with you, girl," Charlie began, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had made up his mind about something. "More patient than I should have been, considering the money your father owed me." Clara's hands shook slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I know, Mr. Morton, I've been trying to find work, but there's not much available for someone like me in this town." Charlie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Work? Clara, you owe me nearly $200. Even if you could find work, it would take you years to pay that back. And I'm not in the business of waiting years." The number hit Clara like a physical blow. $200 might as well have been $2,000. She had maybe $3 to her name, and that was only because she had found some coins hidden in her father's old boots. "There's got to be something we can work out," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I could work at the saloon, cleaning or cooking." "I've got all the help I need," Charlie replied, leaning back in his chair. "But I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I've found a solution that works for everyone." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Something in Charlie's tone told her she wasn't going to like whatever solution he had in mind. "There's a prospector named Samuel Reed who's been coming into town lately," Charlie continued. "He's got a claim up in the hills, and he's been looking for someone to help him through the winter. Cook his meals, keep his cabin tidy, that sort of thing. He's willing to pay good money for the right person." Clara frowned. "You want me to work for this man? Up in the mountains?" "I want you to marry him," Charlie said bluntly. "Or at least that's what we'll call it. He's lonely up there, and he needs someone to take care of him. In exchange, he'll pay off your debt to me." The words hit Clara like a slap across the face. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You can't be serious. You're talking about selling me like I'm a piece of livestock." Charlie's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about solving both your problems and mine. You need money, Reed needs a woman, and I need to be paid what I'm owed. Everyone wins." "I won't do it," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There has to be another way." One of the men near the door spoke up for the first time. "Miss, winter's coming fast. You got no money, no family, and no prospects. You can't survive out here on your own." Clara looked around her small cabin, at the thin walls that barely kept out the cold, at the dwindling pile of firewood in the corner. They were right about one thing. She probably wouldn't survive the winter alone. But what they were proposing seemed worse than death. "Samuel's not a bad man," Charlie said, his tone becoming almost gentle. "He's just lonely and needs help. You'd have a roof over your head, food to eat, and protection from the elements. It's more than you have now." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of these men. "And what if I refuse?" Charlie's facade of kindness disappeared instantly. "Then I'll have to collect my debt some other way. I own this cabin now, Clara. Your father put it up as collateral. I could throw you out tonight if I wanted to." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara knew Charlie meant every word. She had seen what happened to people who couldn't pay their debts in Deadwood Gulch. They didn't just lose their homes. They often lost much more. "I need time to think about this," Clara said quietly. "You've got until tomorrow morning," Charlie replied, standing up. "Samuel's coming to town then, and he'll want to meet you. If you're smart, you'll make the right choice." After the men left, Clara sat alone in the darkness for a long time. She thought about her parents, about the dreams they had shared for a better life in America. She thought about her younger brother Tommy, who had died of sickness during their first winter in the new country. She thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment. Sitting in a cold cabin with no good options left, outside she could hear the sounds of the town settling down for the night. Horses moving in. The streets, men talking and laughing as they left the saloons, the distant sound of a harmonica playing a sad tune. It was a hard place full of hard people, and Clara had learned that survival often meant making choices that would have horrified her just a few months ago as she prepared for bed. Clara noticed movement outside her window. A figure stood in the shadows across the street, watching her cabin. She couldn't make out who it was, but something about the way the person stood, so still and alert, made her think of the native scouts she had seen around town. Most people in Deadwood Gulch spoke about the local tribes with fear and suspicion, but Clara had always wondered what they really thought about the flood of prospectors and settlers who had invaded their land. The figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara to wonder if she had imagined it. Tomorrow would bring Samuel Reed and the choice that would determine the rest of her life. As she lay down on her thin mattress, Clara whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, asking for the strength to face whatever came next. She had no way of knowing that her prayer had been heard or that help would come from the most unexpected source. In the hills surrounding Deadwood Gulch, other eyes were watching and other plans were being made. The story of Clara O'Brien was far from over, and sometimes salvation came from the most unlikely places. The wagon ride to Samuel Reed's mining camp took most of the day, winding through narrow mountain paths that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into the wilderness. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, her few remaining possessions bundled beside her, watching the trees grow thicker and the sky grow smaller above them. Samuel hadn't spoken much during the journey, just occasional grunts and complaints about the rough trail. When they finally arrived at the camp, Clara's heart sank. She had expected something basic, but this was worse than she had imagined. The cabin was little more than a shack made of rough-hewn logs with gaps between them that would let in the cold mountain wind. Nearby stood a crude wooden structure that Samuel called his workshop, where he processed the dirt and rock he dug from his claim. "This is it," Samuel said, climbing down from the wagon. "Home sweet home." Clara looked around at the isolated clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The nearest neighbor was probably 20 miles away, and winter was already painting frost on the morning grass. She felt like she was looking at a prison with walls made of mountains and snow. "The cabin's not much to look at, but it keeps the rain out," Samuel continued, apparently not noticing Clara's dismay. "You'll be sleeping in the back corner. I've got a curtain you can hang for privacy." Inside the cabin, Clara found a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and Samuel's bed in one corner. The back corner he had mentioned was barely large enough for a bedroll, with no window and no real separation from the rest of the space. The whole place smelled of unwashed clothes, old food, and something else Clara couldn't identify but didn't want to think about too closely. "I get up before dawn," Samuel explained, settling into his chair by the fire. "I'll need breakfast ready by the time I'm dressed." Bacon, eggs if we have them, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. After that, you'll clean up the cabin, mend any clothes that need mending, and start preparing lunch." Clara nodded, though inside she felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't a marriage or even a working arrangement. It was exactly what Charlie Morton had made it sound like. She was here to serve Samuel's needs, nothing more. "During the day, you'll help me at the mine," Samuel continued. "I need someone to sort through the dirt and rock I dig up, looking for gold. Your eyes are younger than mine, so you might spot things I miss. In the evening, you'll cook supper and clean up afterward." "What about Sundays?" Clara asked, hoping for at least one day of rest. Samuel laughed harshly. "Sunday's just another day up here, girl. Gold doesn't care what day it is, and neither do I." Over the following days, Clara learned the brutal routine of life at the mining camp. Samuel was up every morning before the sun, shaking her awake and demanding his breakfast. He ate quickly and without conversation, then headed out to the mine shaft he had dug into the hillside. Clara would follow with a bucket of water and whatever tools he might need. The work was backbreaking. Samuel would dig and blast rock from the mine face, and Clara would help carry out buckets of dirt and stone. Then came the sorting, sitting by the cold stream that ran near the camp, washing dirt through a pan and looking for the tiny flakes of gold that Samuel was convinced were there in abundance. "I can feel it," Samuel would say, his eyes bright with an intensity that made Clara uncomfortable. "The gold is here, just waiting for us to find it. A big strike, maybe the biggest this territory has ever seen." But as the days passed, they found only small flakes and dust, barely enough to fill a small pouch. Samuel's mood grew darker with each disappointing day. He would mutter to himself while working, sometimes forgetting that Clara was there, sometimes suddenly snapping at her for no apparent reason. "You're not looking hard enough," he would say when their daily take was particularly small. "Gold is tricky. It hides from lazy people." Clara learned to stay quiet during these outbursts. She had quickly realized that Samuel's grip on reality was not as firm as it should be. He talked to himself constantly, carried on conversations with people who weren't there, and sometimes stared at the mountains around them as if he could see enemies hiding in the trees. The cabin offered little comfort at the end of each long day. Clara had managed to string up a blanket for privacy in her corner, but the thin walls did nothing to block out Samuel's restless movements and strange nighttime mutterings. She often lay awake listening to him pacing around the cabin, talking to himself about gold and claim jumpers and all the people who were supposedly trying to steal his fortune. As the weather grew colder, Clara began to understand just how trapped she really was. The mountain paths were becoming difficult to navigate, and soon they would be completely impassable. Even if she could escape, she had no idea how to find her way back to civilization, and the thought of being lost in the wilderness during winter was terrifying. To keep herself sane, Clara started a secret journal, writing on scraps of paper with a pencil stub she had found in the cabin. She wrote about her life before coming to the camp, about her parents and the dreams they had shared, about her hopes for somehow finding a way out of this situation. The journal became her lifeline, a way to hold on to who she was when everything else felt like it was slipping away. During her time at the stream, Clara also began to notice signs that they were not alone in these mountains. Sometimes she would find moccasin tracks in the soft earth near the water. Once she discovered the remains of a small fire that was clearly not made by Samuel or herself. She mentioned these findings to Samuel, but he dismissed them as animal tracks and natural burns. "Indians don't come up this high," he said confidently. "Too cold for them." But Clara wasn't convinced. She had grown up hearing stories about the native tribes who had lived in these mountains for generations before the prospectors arrived. It made sense that they would still be here, watching the newcomers who had invaded their homeland. One morning, while washing clothes in the stream, Clara found something that made her heart race. Hidden under a flat rock near the water's edge was a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside, she found dried meat, some kind of root vegetables, and a piece of birch bark with symbols drawn on it that she didn't understand. Clara looked around carefully, but saw no one. Still, she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. Instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of hope. Someone else was out there, someone who might understand that she was in trouble. She carefully rewrapped the bundle and left it where she had found it, but placed a small stone on top as a sign that she had discovered it. When she returned to the stream the next day, the bundle was gone. But in its place was a single eagle feather. Samuel's behavior was becoming more erratic as the days grew shorter. He would spend hours staring at his small collection of gold. Dust, counting and recounting it, muttering about how it wasn't enough, how there had to be more. He started accusing Clara of stealing from him, searching through her few possessions and demanding to know where she had hidden the gold he was sure she had taken. "I know you're planning something," he would say, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Women are all the same. Can't trust any of them." Clara realized that her situation was becoming more dangerous. Samuel's paranoia was growing worse, and she was completely isolated with a man who was clearly losing his grip on reality. The mountains around them were beautiful but unforgiving, and winter was coming fast, but someone out there was watching. Someone who had left her food and signs of friendship. As Clara fell asleep each night to the sound of Samuel's restless pacing, she held on to the hope that she wasn't as alone as she seemed. In the darkness outside the cabin, other eyes were indeed watching, and other plans were slowly taking shape. High in the mountains above Samuel Reed's mining camp, Lakota crouched behind a cluster of pine trees, watching the small cabin through the early morning mist. For weeks now, he had been observing the prospector and the young woman who had been brought to his claim. What he saw troubled him deeply. Lakota was a scout for his people, the Lakota, and his job was to watch the movements of the white settlers who continued to pour into their sacred lands. The Black Hills were more than just mountains to his people. They were the heart of their spiritual world, a place where their ancestors had walked and where the spirits still dwelled. Every new mining camp was like a wound in the earth, and Lakota's duty was to report back to the tribal council about these intrusions. But this situation was different from the others he had observed. The woman down there was not a willing participant in the destruction of his people's homeland. She was a prisoner, just as much a victim of the white man's greed as the land itself. Through his careful watching, Lakota had learned the rhythm of the camp. He had seen how the prospector forced the woman to work from dawn to dusk, how she flinched when he raised his voice, how she looked toward the mountains with the same longing for freedom that Lakota felt when he thought about his people's lost hunting grounds. The night before, Lakota had made a difficult journey to the winter camp where the tribal elders were gathered. The old men had listened carefully as he described what he had seen, their weathered faces grave in the firelight. "The white man's madness spreads like disease," said Gray Wolf, the oldest of the elders. "First they take our land, then they destroy each other fighting over the yellow metal." "But what of the woman?" Lakota had asked. "She suffers as we suffer," the elders had debated long into the night. Some argued that the woman's fate was not their concern, that helping her might bring more soldiers into the mountains. Others pointed out that true warriors protected those who could not protect themselves, regardless of the color of their skin. Finally, Gray Wolf had spoken the words that Lakota had been hoping to hear. "The spirits judge us not by the color of our skin, but by the courage of our hearts. If you believe this woman needs help, then help her. But be careful, young scout. The consequences of your actions will affect more than just yourself." Now, as Lakota watched the cabin in the pale dawn light, he saw that the situation had grown even worse. Through the thin walls, he could hear the prospector's voice raised in anger, shouting words that made Lakota's jaw tighten. The man's mind was clearly breaking under the strain of his obsession with gold. Clara had been awake most of the night, listening to Samuel pace around the cabin like a caged animal. His muttering had grown more intense, and she had heard him, talking to people who weren't there, having entire conversations with invisible claim jumpers and thieves. When morning came, he seemed even more unstable than usual. "Where is it?" Samuel demanded, grabbing Clara's arm as she tried to prepare his breakfast. "I know you took it. You think I'm stupid, but I see everything." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice calm. I haven't taken anything. The gold? Samuel shouted, his grip tightening. Someone's been stealing from my pouch. Little bits at a time, thinking I wouldn't notice. But I count every flake, every grain. Clara tried to pull away, but Samuel's fingers dug deeper into her arm. Please, you're hurting me. I would never steal from you. Lies, Samuel's eyes were. Wild now, darting around the cabin as if he expected to see hidden enemies in every shadow. It's not just the gold. Someone's been watching us. I can feel them out there, waiting for their chance. For a moment, Clara wondered if Samuel might be right about being watched. She had found more signs near the stream, small offerings of food, a warm fur left where she did the washing, tracks that definitely didn't belong to either of them. But she had never seen anyone, and she certainly hadn't stolen any gold. You're working with them, aren't you? Samuel continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. The Indians, I've seen the signs. They're planning to attack us and take my claim. That's not true, Clara said, but Samuel was beyond listening to reason. I should have known better than to trust a woman, he snarled. Charlie Morton, probably. Planned this whole thing. Sent you up here to spy on me, to signal your savage friends when it was time to strike. Samuel's paranoia had reached a dangerous new level. Clara could see in his eyes that he was capable of violence, that his obsession with gold had consumed whatever sanity he had left. She had to get away from him, but the cabin felt like a trap with only one door and Samuel blocking her path to it. I need to go to the stream, Clara said, trying to sound normal. To get water for your coffee. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, then grabbed his rifle from beside the door. You can get water, but I'm coming with you. Can't trust you alone anymore. At the stream, Samuel stood behind Clara with his rifle, watching the trees as if enemies might emerge at any moment. Clara filled the water bucket with shaking hands, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to escape. The morning air was bitter cold, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. Hurry up, Samuel snapped. We've been out here too long already. As they walked back toward the cabin, Clara noticed fresh snow beginning to fall. The flakes were large and heavy, the kind that meant a serious storm was coming. Samuel seemed oblivious to the weather, too focused on his imaginary enemies to notice the real danger approaching. Back in the cabin, Samuel's behavior grew even more erratic. He started boarding up the windows, muttering about preparing for an attack. Clara watched in growing alarm as he turned their shelter into a fortress, trapping them both inside with no way out. They'll come at night, Samuel said, nailing boards. Across the last window. That's when they always attack. But we'll be ready for them. The cabin was now completely dark except for the flickering light from the fireplace. Clara felt the walls closing in around her, and she knew that Samuel's madness had reached a point where she was no longer safe. The snow outside was falling. Harder now, and she could hear the wind beginning to howl through the trees. That evening, as Samuel dozed fitfully in his chair with the rifle across his lap, Clara made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer for help to arrive. She had to try to escape, even if it meant facing the storm and the wilderness alone, moving as quietly as she could. Clara gathered her warmest clothes and the small amount of food she could carry. She waited until Samuel's breathing became deep and regular, then carefully lifted the bar from the door and slipped outside into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, and the snow was so thick she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. Clara had no idea which direction to go, but she knew she had to get as far away from the cabin as possible before Samuel woke up. She stumbled through the drifts, her feet already numb from the cold, following what she hoped was the path down. The mountain within an hour, Clara realized she was lost. The storm had erased all familiar landmarks, and every direction looked the same. Her hands and feet were becoming dangerously cold, and she could feel exhaustion pulling at her with each step. She had escaped Samuel, but she might have traded one death for another. Just as Clara felt her strength giving out, she saw a dim light flickering through the snow. Hope surged through her as she struggled toward it, but as she got closer, She realized it wasn't the warm glow of a cabin window. Someone was holding a torch, and the person standing in the storm was unlike anyone Clara had ever seen. The man was tall and lean, with long black hair and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He was dressed in buckskin and furs, and he moved through the snow with an ease that seemed impossible. When he saw Clara, he immediately came forward and caught her just as her legs gave out. "You cannot stay here," he said in English that was accented but clear. "The storm will kill you." Clara looked up at the face of the man who had been watching over her from the shadows. In her exhaustion and relief, she could only whisper, "Please, help me." Without another word, the man lifted Clara and carried her through the storm to a place she never would have found on her own, a hidden cave in the rocks, warm and dry and safe from both the weather and the madness she had left behind. Samuel Reed woke to the sound of wind howling through the cabin walls and immediately knew something was wrong. The storm had been raging for hours, but it was a different kind of silence that made his skin crawl. He reached for his rifle and saw that the door was unbarred. Clara was gone. "No!" Samuel roared, throwing open the door and stepping into the blizzard. Snow immediately whipped into his face, stinging his eyes and making it hard to see. But he could make out footprints leading away from the cabin, already being filled in by the falling snow. "She's running to them. I knew it." Samuel's mind raced with paranoid thoughts. Clara hadn't just escaped. She had fled to join the Indians he was convinced were plotting against him. They had probably been communicating all along, and now she was leading them back to steal his gold and kill him. He had to stop her before it was too late. Fighting against the storm, Samuel made his way down the mountain path toward Deadwood Gulch, the journey that usually took half a day took him nearly all night in the blizzard, but his anger and fear drove him forward. By the time he reached town, he was half frozen but burning with rage. The Silver Dollar Saloon was still busy despite the late hour. Samuel burst through the doors, his wild appearance and frantic manner immediately drawing attention from the patrons. Charlie Morton looked up from behind the bar, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw Samuel's condition. "Reed!" Charlie called out. "What are you doing down here in this storm?" "She's gone?" Samuel shouted, his voice carrying across the entire saloon. "The woman you gave me, she's run off to join the savages." The conversations around the room died as everyone turned to listen. Samuel's words had struck a nerve with the miners and prospectors who lived in constant fear of Indian attacks. "Slow down," Charlie said, moving around the bar. "What exactly happened?" "I woke up and she was gone," Samuel continued, his eyes wild and unfocused. "But this wasn't just an escape. She's been working with them all along, sending signals, telling them about my claim. Now they know exactly where to find me." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. These men had all heard stories of settlers who had been attacked after being betrayed by someone they trusted. "Are you sure about this?" asked Tom Bradley, one of the larger miners. "Maybe she just tried to run away on her own. In a blizzard?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "Nobody would be that stupid. No, she had help. They came for her, and now they're planning to come for all of us." Charlie Morton studied Samuel's face carefully. He could see the man was on the edge of complete breakdown, but he also knew that Indian attacks were always a possibility. More importantly, he saw an opportunity. If Clara had truly escaped, she might try to report what had happened to her. That could bring unwanted attention to his business arrangements. "Boys," Charlie announced to the room, "we might have a serious problem here. If the Indians have taken one of our women, we need to act fast." "She wasn't taken," Samuel insisted. "She went willingly. She's a traitor." "Either way," Charlie continued, "we can't let this stand. If we don't respond, it'll just encourage more attacks." Within an hour, Charlie had assembled a group of 6 armed men, including Samuel and Tom Bradley. They waited for the storm to pass, then set out at first light with rifles, pistols, and enough supplies for several days in the mountains. Meanwhile, in the hidden cave high above the mining camp, Clara was slowly recovering from her ordeal. The cave was larger than it had appeared from the outside, with a natural chimney that allowed for a small fire without giving away their location. Dakota had wrapped her in warm furs and given her food and water, but he remained wary and alert. Your people will come looking for you, Dakota said, watching the cave entrance. The crazy man will not accept losing what he believes he owns, Clara nodded, still shaken by her escape. His name is Samuel Reed. He's not well. The gold has made him sick in his mind. The yellow metal does this to your people, Dakota replied. It makes them forget what is important. What will happen when they come? Clara asked. Dakota was quiet for a long moment. I hope they do not come. But if they do, I will protect you. You don't have to do this, Clara said. I'm not your responsibility. Every person who suffers injustice is my responsibility, Dakota answered. That is what it means to be a warrior. On the second day, Dakota's worst fears were realized. He heard the sound of horses and men's voices echoing through the valley below. From the cave entrance, he could see the group of armed men following the old trail toward the upper mountains. They are coming, Dakota told Clara. 7 men, all armed. Clara felt her heart sink. She had hoped that Samuel would simply assume. She had died in the storm, but she should have known better. His obsession with the gold made him obsessed with everything he considered his property. Maybe I should go to them, Clara said. If I explain what happened, maybe they'll leave you alone. No, Dakota said firmly. They are not coming to talk. They are coming to kill. Dakota began preparing for what he knew would be a difficult fight. He checked his weapons, a bow with a quiver of arrows, a knife, and a tomahawk. Against 7 armed men, he would need to use every advantage the terrain could give him. Stay deep in the cave, he told Clara. No matter what happens, do not come out until I call for you. The group of men from town was making slow progress up the mountain. The storm had left deep snow in many places, and they had to dismount and lead their horses through the difficult terrain. Samuel grew more agitated with each delay. They're getting away, he kept saying. Every minute we waste gives them more. Time to prepare. Calm down, Reed, Charlie Morton replied. We'll find them. Indians can't hide forever. Tom Bradley, who had been studying the tracks they were following, looked troubled. These aren't the tracks of a war party, he said. Looks like maybe one person moving alone. One person was all it took to steal my woman, Samuel snarled. But there are probably more waiting in ambush. As they climbed higher, the men became more nervous. The mountains seemed to press in around them, and every shadow could hide an enemy. They were far from town now, in territory that few white men had ever seen. Dakota watched from above as the group approached the area below his cave. He had chosen his position carefully. A narrow ledge that gave him a clear view of the approach, but was difficult to reach from below. The men would have to come up one at a time, giving him the advantage despite being outnumbered. There, Samuel suddenly shouted, pointing toward the cave entrance. I can see smoke. The group dismounted and began climbing toward the cave on foot. Dakota waited until they were halfway up the rocky slope, then made his presence known. Go back, he called out in English. You are not welcome here. The men stopped and looked around, trying to locate the source of the voice. Samuel raised his rifle and fired wildly at the rocks above, the shot echoing through the mountains. There's our savage, Samuel yelled, just like I said. Charlie Morton held up his hand to stop the others from shooting. We want the woman, he called out. Give her back and we'll leave you be. She is free, Dakota replied. She chose to. Leave the crazy man who hurt her. That's a lie. Samuel screamed. She belongs to me. I paid for her. Tom Bradley looked uncomfortable. Hold on, Reed. What do you mean you paid for her? But Samuel was beyond listening to reason. He started climbing again, his rifle ready, and the others followed. Dakota knew the time for talking was over. The battle that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. From deep in the cave, she could hear the sounds of gunfire, shouting, and the clash of weapons. Dakota moved like a shadow across the rocky terrain, using his knowledge of every stone and crevice to stay ahead of the armed men. When Tom Bradley got too close to the cave entrance, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. She picked up a heavy stone and threw it as hard as she could, striking the big miner in the shoulder and causing him to lose his balance on the narrow ledge. "The woman's fighting too!" Someone shouted. Clara realized she was no longer just a victim waiting to be rescued. She was fighting for her own freedom, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. The confrontation continued for what felt like hours. But gradually the sounds of battle moved farther away from the cave. When silence finally returned to the mountains, Clara waited in the darkness, not knowing whether Lakota had survived or if Samuel and his men were about to find her. Then she heard a familiar voice calling her name, and she knew that somehow, against all odds, help had prevailed over hatred in the wilderness of the Black Hills. When Lakota's voice finally called Clara's name from outside the cave, she felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked her to her knees. She had been hiding in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of battle echo through the mountains, not knowing if she would ever see daylight again as a free woman. "Clara, it is safe now," Lakota said as she emerged from the cave into the late afternoon sunlight. "The danger has passed?" Clara looked around at the rocky ledge where the confrontation had taken place. There were signs of the fierce battle, bullet holes in the stone, scattered equipment, and patches of snow stained with blood. But she saw no bodies, which confused her. What happened to them? She asked. Lakota's expression was grim. 3 of them retreated when they realized they could not win. The big man with the dark beard, he fell from the ledge when you threw the stone. He is hurt but alive? The one called Charlie Morton ran when he saw his men failing. And Samuel? Lakota looked toward the edge of the rocky outcrop where the mountain dropped away into a deep ravine. The gold-sick man would not listen to reason. He kept climbing, higher, trying to reach you. I tried to stop him, but his madness made him reckless. He slipped on the wet rocks and fell. Clara felt a complex mix of emotions. Samuel had been her captor, but she had also seen how the gold fever had destroyed his mind. "Is he?" "Yes," Lakota replied quietly. "His suffering is over." They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that this was more than just the end of Samuel Reed. It was the end of a chapter in both their lives, a violent confrontation that had changed them forever. "The others who survived will return to town," Lakota said. "They will tell stories about what happened here. Some will say you were kidnapped by savages. Others will say you betrayed your own people. The truth will become whatever they need." "It to be," Clara nodded, already understanding the difficult position this put her in. "I can't go back to Deadwood Gulch, can I?" "It would not be safe," Lakota agreed. "But there are other places, other towns where you can start fresh. Places where no one knows your story." Over the next 2 days, Lakota helped Clara prepare for her journey back to civilization. He taught her how to read the land, how to find water and shelter, and how to move quietly through the forest. More importantly, he shared stories about his people, their history, their connection to the land, and their struggle to survive as more settlers poured into their territory. "My people have lived in these mountains for generations beyond counting," Lakota told her as they sat by the fire on her last night in the cave. "We know every stream, every game trail, every place where the spirits dwell. But the white settlers see only gold and empty land to be claimed." Clara listened carefully, understanding that she was learning something most people in her world would never hear. "What will happen to your people?" "We will fight for as long as we can," Lakota replied. "But there are so many of your people coming, and they have weapons and diseases that we cannot match. Perhaps someday there will be peace, but it will not be the peace of equals." When morning came, Lakota led Clara down from the mountains by paths she never would have found on her own. They traveled for 2 days, moving carefully to avoid any other mining camps or settlements. Finally, they reached a place where Clara could see the smoke of a town in the distance. "Rock Creek?" Lakota said. "It is far enough from Deadwood Gulch that no one will know your story. You can make a new life there." Clara looked at the man who had risked everything to save her. "How can I ever thank you?" "Use what you have learned," Lakota replied. "Not all white people are like Samuel Reed or Charlie Morton. Some have good hearts. Find those people and help them understand the truth about what is happening in these mountains." They said their goodbyes at the edge of the forest, both knowing they would probably never see each other again. Clara walked toward the town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of gold dust that Lakota had taken from Samuel's abandoned claim, enough to help her start over. Rock Creek was a smaller, quieter town than Deadwood Gulch, with fewer saloons and more families. Clara found work as a teacher in the small schoolhouse, telling people she was a widow who had lost her husband in a mining accident. The lie felt wrong, but she knew the truth would be even more dangerous. As months passed, Clara discovered she had a talent for teaching. The children loved her stories, and she found herself sharing tales that taught them about courage, kindness, and the importance of understanding people who were different from them. She never mentioned Native Americans directly, but she planted seeds of empathy that she hoped would grow in young minds. Clara also began writing letters to newspapers in larger cities, describing the harsh realities of life in the mining camps and the treatment of Native peoples. She signed them with a false name, but her words carried the weight of truth that came from lived experience. 3 years after her escape from Samuel's camp, Clara received an unexpected visitor. Tom Bradley, the large miner who had been part of the group that hunted her, appeared at her schoolhouse one afternoon. Clara's heart raced with fear, but Bradley looked older, sadder, and somehow smaller than she remembered. "I've been looking for you for a long time," he said quietly. "I wanted to apologize for what happened up there. What we did to you wasn't right." Clara studied his face, seeing genuine remorse. "Why now?" "Because I've had time to think about it," Bradley replied. "Samuel Reed was crazy, and Charlie Morton was just greedy, but I knew better. I knew what they were doing to you was wrong, and I went along with it anyway." Bradley went on to tell Clara that Charlie Morton's business had failed, that several of the men who had been involved in the confrontation had left town in shame, and that the whole incident had changed how some people thought about the treatment of women and Native Americans in the territory. "I'm glad you found peace," Bradley said before leaving. "You deserve better than what we gave you." Years continued to pass, and Clara's influence grew. She became known as an advocate for women's rights and fair treatment of Native peoples. Though few people knew the personal experiences that drove her passion. The territory was changing, becoming more civilized, but the conflicts between settlers and Native Americans continued. In 1876, Clara was invited to attend peace negotiations between the United States government and several Native American tribes. She had been asked to serve as a translator and cultural liaison, helping both sides understand each other's perspectives. On the second day of the negotiations, Clara looked across the council circle and saw a familiar face among the Native American representatives. Lakota had grown older, his hair now streaked with gray, but his eyes still held the same intelligence and strength she remembered from their time in the mountains. When their eyes met, both smiled slightly, but they said nothing. They were representing different sides in these negotiations, and any acknowledgement of their shared past could complicate the delicate process of making peace. Later that evening, when the formal meetings had ended, Clara found herself walking alone near the river that ran beside the treaty grounds. She wasn't surprised when Lakota appeared beside her, moving as silently as he had in the mountains years before. "You kept your promise," he said simply. "Which promise?" "To use what you learned, to help people understand." They talked for a long time that night, sharing stories of the years since their mountain encounter. Lakota told her about the battles his people had fought, the land they had lost, and the difficult choices they faced as their traditional way of life became impossible to maintain. Clara shared her work as a teacher and advocate, the letters she had written, and the small changes she had helped bring about in how people thought about justice and human dignity. "Do you think these negotiations will bring real peace?" Clara asked. Lakota was quiet for a long moment. "Peace is not something that can be negotiated in a single meeting. It must be built one person at a time, one understanding at a time. You have been building it in your classroom. I have been building it in my councils with the elders. And if it's not enough?" Then at least we tried, Lakota replied. And perhaps the children you teach will be wiser than we were. When the treaty negotiations ended, Clara and Lakota said goodbye once again, both knowing this time it truly was. Farewell, the peace treaty would be signed, but both understood it would not last. The pressure of westward expansion was too great, and the conflicts were too deep. But in the years that followed, Clara continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She had seen that understanding between different peoples was possible, that courage and compassion could overcome fear and hatred. Every child she taught, every letter she wrote, every speech she gave was a small act of defiance against the forces that had once made her a victim. Lakota returned to his people, where he became a respected elder and peace chief. He worked to prepare his tribe for the difficult times ahead, teaching them when to fight and when to negotiate, when to hold on to tradition and when to adapt to survive. Both carried with them the memory of their brief partnership in the mountains, when a desperate woman and a brave warrior had proved that justice and freedom were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem.